Well, good morning. Are our consultants online? Are they remote? Okay, I can't see them yet. I can see me, which is very disturbing. Um, as the years roll by, I have to tell you. Anyway, still here though. So we'll get going. Respectful of everyone's time, we'll convene the meeting of the Higher Education Financial Sustainability Advisory Board. Try and say that 3 times fast. I don't have any opening comments. Madam Chairman?
Good morning to everybody, and that's about it. Thank you.
Okay. We'll get going then. We'll start with the approval of the minutes from the November 18, 2024 meeting. You should have gotten a copy of that and able to review. I know we did that at our shop. If folks have questions or comments or corrections to the minutes. If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Moved and seconded by Representative Paris. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Minutes are approved. We'll move in. Yes, ma'am.
Do we have a quorum?
Do we have a quorum?
I mean, a quorum.
Well, that's a good question. We're not taking decisions today. We're
Okay.
receiving information. We're not sort of taking action that's going to
Okay. I'm good.
do anything to anyone's rights or responsibilities. We're just receiving information. And of course, it's being recorded. So folks who may be tardy today can check later in terms of the information presented. If there's not any objection, we'll move into the presentation. We have our consultant available to us today. This is a presentation by the consultant, the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems. As part of the 24-25 biennial budget, OPM was allocated some ARPA funds to hire a consulting firm with higher education expertise and relevant experience to conduct an independent third-party study of the Connecticut State Colleges and Universities. The series of recommendations, first of all, I want to thank everyone at the Connecticut State Colleges and Universities, including the students, faculty, and other stakeholders who contributed to the considerable work that produced these recommendations. These recommendations for consideration are data-driven recommendations from our consultant. They have experience around the country with other higher education systems that could position and scale the system to meet projected student demand. We hope become more fiscally stable and operationally efficient, improve student outcomes, and meet our state's workforce needs. It's a comprehensive set of recommendations intended to move the system and the state forward to continue strengthening our higher education system. Some of the recommendations or the manner, scope, and scale at which they are proposed may not be a perfect fit for the system or for the state, but we're optimistic that the information contained in here will enable all of the parties to have a more informed dialogue going forward in terms of options and alternatives that could improve how we serve the students and the state workforce needs. The system and its Board of Regents will have to work on next steps in light of these recommendations. They're there for their review and consideration. It's important to note that the state provides a block grant to the system, but it is their leadership and their board that uses their governance structures to make decisions on how to run that organization, including any personnel decisions, use of their reserves, any other strategies that they may employ to carry out these recommendations. So there's also recommendations here for the legislature to consider, as well as for the governor and OPM to consider in terms of our budget going forward. So we expect a robust discussion on these proposals. Before any decisions ultimately are made based on these recommendations, I should point out there will be plenty of time for public comment and input. We will have a legislative session starting next month. No doubt these recommendations or legislation based on these recommendations or other recommendations out there about other things happening in this space will be considered by the General Assembly with the usual public hearings and debate both in committee and on the floor. So our focus going forward, I think I could speak for everyone in saying our focus is on educating our students to meet the skills that employers are looking for while doing so in a manner that recognizes the needs of the taxpayers of the state of Connecticut. So it's our hope that the NCHEMS recommendations will become a resource for the system and the state to strengthen higher education. With that, I hope Mr. Brian Prescott, who's the president of NCHEMS, is online to be able to provide an overview.
Good morning, Secretary Beckham. It's good to see you virtually this morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. And so I presume that was my introduction and you're ready for me to get started.
Yes, sir. Please go.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen because I've got a presentation I'd like to walk us through. and I'll try to do this as quickly as possible so as to allow for comments and questions. But as the secretary said, we at NCHEMS, we are hold on, let me make sure I'm operating this right. There we go. We are a nonprofit organization located in Boulder, Colorado, where we work on bringing data and evidence to strategic decision making in higher education. And we typically work with state systems and institutions to design policies and practices that meet their goals, many of which are similar across states and reflect an interest in improving student outcomes and in meeting employers and generally workforce needs. We've been doing this kind of work for a very long time. And we have worked in various different times in every state in the country over that 55-year history. We have done a considerable amount of work in Connecticut over the last decade or so. Just for transparency's sake, I will outline that NCHEMS, my predecessors were involved in advising the state prior to the 2010-11 governance change to not make the changes that were made. Those were the state did what the state did. We subsequently had nothing to do with the planning or the organization of the singly accredited institution, Connecticut State. However, when the initial attempt to get single accreditation with then NEASC, now NETCHI, failed, the system asked us to come help with the substantive change application for the accreditor, and we did do that. We also worked with Roberta Willis and her commission on a strategic planning activity in 2015. We also worked with OHE to do some adjustments to their to statutes governing how they operate, as well as regulations that are still in process. And we did work under contract with the system office to look into the particular conditions of Western Connecticut State University. That work was done a couple of years ago, and since then we have also helped the system board at one point think about their roles and responsibilities. That was a very brief activity. All of that led to the selection of us as the consultant for the OPM work. And the purpose of the study really was to sort of take a look at the significant enrollment declines that the system has experienced, as well as looking ahead to a future in which the population of traditional age students is unlikely to grow, and also how to ensure that the viability of the system and its relevance in terms of the programs that it offers can be most effectively deployed to meet the needs of Connecticut and its regions. So the study was really to look into how to restructure and scale the system to ensure its financial sustainability over time and to more effectively meet those needs. We had several items that were indicated as assignments for us in the contract. One was an evaluation of the organizational structure of the system, comparisons between the system, its institutions, and peers around the country, and recommendations about scaling and restructuring the system to meet those changes in enrollment demand that we can look at data and anticipate, as well as to improve student outcomes and the satisfaction of workforce needs by the state. And finally, to provide some indications of short and long-term financial and operational plans. Our approach was, as befits the mission I described earlier, was to gather a ton of data. We gathered a lot of it from publicly available sources, most notably the federal government's data system on higher education IPEDS around the country. We also pulled data from the Census Bureau, from state sources, Connecticut state sources, as well as a significant amount of data supplied by the system office and the institutions. Those data were typically around enrollment information, financials of the system. We also got information about the organizational structure of the system itself and of the institutions. And we saw information about the kind of facilities that are run by the system and its institutions. Additionally, we gathered information from other systems around the country through a survey in partnership with the National Association of Higher Education Systems, which is now known as NASH. I know that acronym doesn't quite match the name I said, but that's just how they've made it happen. And then we also engaged in a significant amount of stakeholder engagement that I'll outline in a moment. Of course, we did a lot of drafting and review. In the course of that drafting and review, we exchanged drafts with OPM, of course, but also with the system office. And we gathered information via the system office from various parties, stakeholder groups in the system, including institutional leadership. I believe it wasn't my job to share it, but I believe that other entities, including the faculty, some of the faculty anyway, received these reports to comment on. Our stakeholder engagement efforts were pretty extensive. We conducted 3 visits to the state. The first one was just to gather some information and level set about the nature of the project that we were going to take on. And then in April, we had 2 teams of 2 traveling all over the state, meeting with state leadership, both the state and the system leadership, as well as a couple of members of the legislature that I believe are members of this board. But most of that trip really was to travel around and visit the campuses and speak with institutional leaders there. We had in many of the sites, we had very large meetings with faculty and staff. The institutions were able to recruit students to come talk to us about their experiences, and we also sought to talk to local and regional employers and civic leaders. And then in September, sorry, I should mention, during that April meeting, we really were wanting to understand the contextual information about the experiences of all of these different kinds of stakeholders, talk about the challenges they're facing, try and learn about what kinds of attempts they're undertaking to address the challenges that they see, and to sort of understand what their perspective is on the role of the system and of the institutions and how our report could be most helpful to meeting the needs of the state. In September, when we came back, a team of 2 were in the state for a week. Again, we met briefly with state leadership, but we also again visited all the campuses, mainly to visit with the president and his or her cabinet. But also we had some, an in-person and a combination in-person virtual meeting with the faculty senate leaders around the state, as well as with union leaders while we were there. These meetings were really designed to try to put some ideas about where our report might go on the table and gather some input about that. We also, throughout the project, had regular communication with both OPM and CSCU leaders. We had 2 meetings with a new board chair. We had a meeting with the Faculty Advisory Council co-chairs in the early part of the project. And then, as you probably remember, I appeared before this advisory board, and I believe it was September, to talk just about the current and future conditions that are facing higher education nationally, to sort of set Connecticut's experience into that broader context. And I want to kind of just, as part of, and kind of going over our report, I won't belabor this, but some of these graphs and first parts of the data are a little bit of a repeat from that September conversation. But the first thing we would say is that enrollment declines are not just happening in Connecticut. They've been happening nationally, and they've been especially happening in the public comprehensive and 2-year institutions across the nation. Not so much in the public research or in the private nonprofits, although there is certainly a lot of consternation about the financial health of some private nonprofits. In the public sector, it's really the public comprehensive 4-year institutions and the 2-year institutions that have been seeing their enrollments drop, the very institutions that CSCU is made up of. This is part of a demographic picture in which the number of high school graduates has been declining and the number of traditional age student individuals generally has been declining, but it's also the effect of weakening college going rates. So both of these numbers, demographically, in terms of the number of traditional age college students and college going rates, have been up until about in terms of population, early 2010s, 2015 or so, and through 2015 or so, the college going rate, both of those numbers were on an uninterrupted 3-decade-long increase. And what we're seeing in the recent past is that those two numbers are starting to go in the opposite direction, and the effects are compounding. The effects of declining population is compounded by less likelihood of traditional age students to go to college. At the same time, adults who might otherwise be making up some of the spaces that the traditional age students are leaving unfilled are seeing larger opportunity costs associated with not working and going to college instead because of the relatively strong and long-term health of the economy. I do want to note that Connecticut is one of the most generous states in funding higher education. When you look at just state appropriations to UConn, CSU systems, the private institutions that get some direct funding in your state, as well as the financial aid program, UConn ranks among the top, what looks like 6 or 7 in the country there on that top graph. And then when you combine the appropriations that come from the state and tuition revenue, Connecticut has the 3rd highest funding per student among all states in the country, which I think is important context for what the rest of the report has to say. Then we made sort of 4 high-level observations about what we found in the data and in part from our stakeholder engagement. The first of which is really that the system and its institutions are not going to see much improvement in the future outlook going forward in terms of the enrollment demand that comes just from sheer numbers. I will say that top graph does show that there's an opportunity to recruit more adult learners, but the number of traditional age students in that top graph, which comes from the state of Connecticut, has been trending downward and is projected to continue downward. This is compounded by changes projected in the number of high school graduates by state that are unfavorable as well. I will note that just last week, a week ago today, the source for these data, which is the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, they released their newest high school graduates projections, and there's good news for Connecticut in these data. Connecticut's numbers improve from what these data suggest. So between 2023 and 2041, in the new projections from WICHE, Connecticut's total numbers are expected to decline by only 4% over that period of time. And the national number is expected to decline by 10%. So Connecticut moves from being in a worse projected position than the nation to a better position, but the numbers are all still down, and the nation's numbers are further down than they had been projected up to this point over that period of time. In addition, the system will continue to face competition amongst institutions within and outside of Connecticut. The upper graph on the right there indicates that over the period that's been measured, the orange line, which is Connecticut State, and the bright red line, which is the CSUs, all by fall 2022 were below. They had fewer students they had a smaller share relative to the other institutions among first-time in-state students that they were attracting. So while the nonprofit private institutions in the state, UConn and its branch campuses were all seeing growth throughout that period, Connecticut State fell dramatically in terms of the overall share of the college of the enrollments that they were able to attract. And CSU, while it did well for the first couple of years in that period, also fell below where they were at the beginning part. In addition, more Connecticut residents are looking outside the state for college enrollment. That's the lower left graph. And then to sort of put some context to that, I would point out that the graph on the right is a little complicated, but it suggests that that the students who are leaving Connecticut are tending to leave Connecticut for public research universities. They're not necessary. If I'm a student that is looking at enrolling in Eastern Connecticut State University or Bridgewater State in Massachusetts, these data show that over this period of time, I'm more likely to stay in-state at Eastern than go to Bridgewater. But the opposite is true if I'm choosing between UConn and UMass Amherst, for example. The second high-level observation we made is that the response by the system has not really been sufficient to bring its costs into alignment with its revenue. Well, there's a number of data slides and exhibits in our report that make this point. Our report does it based on peer analysis of similar institutions elsewhere in the country. But there are some conditions in Connecticut that make just doing this based on expenses and dollar amounts a little complicated. And what we've chosen to do here is to highlight just the staffing levels generally. And you can see that because the enrollment decline in the upper graph, the enrollment decline has been steeper than changes in the decline in faculty and other staff. The ratio between employees and students has gone up in the opposite direction for financial sustainability. It should be said that in higher education, it's very difficult to make these data go, directly in lockstep with one another, and there may be some reasons to be careful about trying to do that. But nevertheless, overall, there's more human resources being deployed to serve the number of students than has been the case in the recent past. And because the costs of personnel in higher education occupy about 70 to 80% of the overall institutional budgets, this is a significant driver of what the overall funding and expenditure picture looks like in the system. The third observation we would make is that CSCU has struggled to really undertake successful system-level strategic approaches to address these challenges that it's facing. Among the problems that we highlight are that in addition to just the overall numbers, the personnel aren't always organized in the right places or in the right roles to meet the needs of the students most effectively. That there is a lot of, it's really important to bear in mind as you think about the report and the recommendations we're likely to make, that CSCU is a really young system. Most of the systems in this country are much older than the 10 or 11, 12 years that CSCU as a system has existed. CSCU is trying to grow up, frankly, in a time of great turmoil. Everyone knows in Connecticut, I think, that the consolidation of the 12 community colleges into Connecticut State has been a significant challenge that has demanded a lot of political work to be done to sort of bring that around to a single institution, and work remains on that front. Hasn't been easy. And at the same time, these overall trends that I just described in the higher education landscape are really challenging systems to think everywhere, not just in Connecticut, to think differently about their roles, the appropriate roles that they play. And so this second point is made in the context of those realities, which is that figuring out really where the role of the system ends and the institutions begin is a challenge that I don't think that CSCU has really mastered yet. As I mentioned, the efforts to really bring services and implement not just the shared services, but to implement other initiatives have been poorly executed by the system in recent years. And in addition, resources that the system could be using to help drive some of these changes have not really been used strategically to address the financial sustainability issues. In addition, there's been a significant change in the leadership of the board, but board oversight has not really created the kind of accountability structures that are necessary for all this work to happen effectively. I will also say, as I make that point, that at a time of declining enrollments, being a volunteer board member for a system that is facing the kind of turmoil that CSCU has been facing is not an easy task. And so we're asking these volunteer board members to take bold initiatives when they're facing significant challenges. Many of them have full-time jobs, and it's not for the faint of heart, I would say. And so while we make this point about insufficient board oversight, we just need to recognize the difficulty of actually carrying out that effectively, and the kind of support, and to think ahead about the kind of support board members and boards as a group really need to be effective in this new sort of set of dynamics. The fourth observation we make is just that not everything that is plaguing CSCU is really under its own control. And so I already mentioned all those contextual conditions that make it challenging. But in addition, there are some things that the state has set up that create some management challenges. First of which is that there is no statewide coordinating body, single statewide coordinating body for post-secondary education that would help to direct the state investments and organize the way in which activity around post-secondary education is deliberately and strategically managed in the interest of the state. There is also a lack of clear and overarching state goals about what the state wants out of its post-secondary institutions. I'll mention the CBAC negotiations. The state sets some of the groundwork for how pay and benefits are impacting the budget at CSCU, although there's a lot that CSCU still exercises discretion over that can either worsen or improve the way in which their budgets look. The state itself provides a funding approach that really doesn't offer many incentives to the system or its institutions to respond to, nor does it set any expectations for affordability levels for students. That includes UConn as well, and it includes the state financial aid programs. There's not a statewide policy for dual enrollment, although there are some investments that have been made primarily with stimulus money. But in other states in the nation, community colleges in particular shoulder a large chunk of the burden for dual enrollment, and that is one of the important ways in which those institutions have sort of responded to the enrollment declines I mentioned in their sector before. That is not something that is as easy for Connecticut State to do, or for CSCU institutions generally. And then finally, we heard a lot of concern on the part of leaders within the system that state political culture and fear of possible responses from legislatures really causes them to think twice before they make some controversial decisions about addressing the employee complement in various different ways, or thinking about where they have sites or what's happening in those sites. We also, in addition to those four major points, we also made observations concerning some particular topics that went a little deeper. One was around the use of data and the involvement of the CSU system in Connecticut's P20 WIN, statewide longitudinal data system, that was intended to try to ensure that data are more widely available and useful for making strategic decisions by the state and also by the system. We made some comments about the role of Charter Oak. Charter Oak is an interesting institution. It has a different business model than the other five institutions in the system. It serves a different population of students, yet it hasn't grown significantly over its history. It is an opportunity for the state to look to it for some innovation strategies. And so our recommendations, I'm previewing the recommendations, but it talks about the potential value of Charter Oak as being a place for its resources and its specialties to be more widely and functionally delivered. We were asked specifically in the report to address the availability of space and facilities throughout the system. CSCU also had commissioned a report by a space management and architecture firm, and we did the same thing. It was both of those two reports came and largely complemented one another, and generally found that the system has more space than it needs. Our report also found that there was lacking information about the space inventories at a detail that would really help the system and its institutions make decisions about how best to use and organize space. And as a consequence, some of the stuff that comes forward to be funded by the legislature and the bonding authority is not prioritized in ways that make the most sense. And so I think, and there's also a lack of facilities plans in some of the CSU systems that I think needs to happen. And then we spent some time on this question of statewide policy leadership that addresses the extent to which, for example, CSCU institutions and UConn's branch campuses are often competing for the same students. And when we look at the demographic picture, there's an open question about whether or not that is the best strategy going forward for the state. In addition, there's substantial funding being delivered to these institutions without a clear set of priorities, policy leadership that's focused on the specific needs of and practice of higher education would really help, I think, the state make wiser choices. It is the case that there is a separate entity, OHE, that manages the state financial aid programs, also oversees program approval by the private institutions in the state, and serves as the portal for the state reciprocity agreements that allow students in one state to attend online students or institutions in other states. OHE's mission does not include exercising policy leadership currently. In addition, there is the role that OPM plays, and that to us is not necessarily a suitable supplement or suitable substitute for a separate entity to do statewide policy leadership. It is the governor's, as the arm of the governors and the governor's agenda, and a statewide policy leadership function should be something that creates a buffer between the changes in state political leadership and the needs of the institutions and in the state. So we made some comments related to that. And then finally, we talked about the weaknesses in the state appropriation policy and resource allocation practices across the state and within CSU as currently practiced. I will note that the system has been working on a new resource allocation strategy for how they direct the state grant or the state block grant portion of their funding, but I have not seen what they've come up with just yet. As we move into okay, what to do about all of this, we elected to present the governance questions in the form of a variety of options with pros and cons sort of associated with them. So we identified, there's probably more than 6, but we identified 6 ways to think about the governance and organization of the CSCU system, one of the chief tasks of the assignment that we had. And the first option really is to keep the current structure and system office with the understanding that significant change in how the system office itself will function and how it's held accountable to meet the state needs would need to go along with that. The second option would be to eliminate the system altogether and leave 6 individually accredited institutions. A third option would be to eliminate the system, but to designate one of its member institutions to sort of carry out system-wide functions. These would be things like, how do we get scale around purchasing? How do we handle policy that isn't going to change from one institution to the next around the use of the application of the collective bargaining agreements? How do we ensure that students are able to transfer smoothly from one institution to another? And a whole array of other things that really focus on how do we ensure that the state's needs are being met by using the combined assets that are represented by the institutions. The fourth way is to sort of go back in time to a pre-2010 structure, which we can't quite do because of the merger of the 12 formerly independent community colleges into Connecticut State. But this would look like CSCU as a system, along with Charter Oak as a separate entity, and Connecticut State as well. A fifth one here is not really mutually exclusive with the others, and in fact, as you'll see, we think this is a worthwhile thing to think about, but it's really baked in the notion that the shared services function within CSCU hasn't been organized in a way that really creates incentives or a market around how those back office functions are being served. And so we have some ideas about a separate services organization that would help ensure that the information and feedback loop is robust while also creating incentives for those services to be effectively delivered to the members of the system. And then a sixth one, we don't think has any political legs at all, but for comprehensiveness, we included it, and that would be to incorporate UConn into a statewide system. That last one does have one important and advantage related to what's next, which is that if there's a single system that covers the entire public higher education and infrastructure, then there's less need for that state policy coordination function that I mentioned earlier, and which is the subject of this next slide. So we also believed that it's important that there be a state higher education agency that focuses on the needs of the state as described earlier. And there are 4 options we identified for doing that. One would be to preserve the status quo, in which there isn't anybody that really exercises that statewide coordination function. A second one would be to replace OHE with a new coordinating board, and then let OHE function for a while that gets set up, and then fold OHE and its activities into that coordinating board. That would look a lot like a lot of what other states with coordinating boards have. Third one would be to create a new coordinating board that is and remains separate from OHE. And then fourth would be to take OHE and add things to its mission to ensure that it's able to exercise its policy leadership function as well. The second and fourth are different largely in order, and also in the fact that into the second version of this, there would be a body, a coordinating, the executive director of the body that does this task would report to a board that is appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate, or some combination of tasks like that. Whereas in the fourth one, OHE currently is part of the governor's line authority and would remain that way. In order to determine what recommendations we ought to bring forward from these options and in other areas, we identified a series of principles that really start with the needs of the student and of the state. And that the notion that institutions, all of the institutions and the system itself, are a means to an end. Although at NCHEMS we are very fond of higher education, we believe that it's crucial to meeting the needs of students in the state and bringing, creating economic prosperity and social health and all of the rest. If there were a way to do it other than higher education institutions, we'd be open to that possibility. However, that we don't see that to be the case, but it's important to recognize that our work tends to elevate the needs of students and state needs first. We also think it's important that changes should not leave behind anybody from any part of the state. This is less problematic to some degree in Connecticut because it's relatively small. Its rural spaces are relatively less vast, but it's nevertheless the case that we think it's important that the needs of even the northeastern part, which is relatively not as well populated of Connecticut, as they're being met as well. Also, educational opportunities should be available to everyone, no matter what their background, race, ethnicity, income level, age, all of the rest is. And we also think that you should design the way that the needs of the entity and how that should function, and then build the form around it. Also, we think that increasingly, especially as we experience fewer individuals, there's going to be a need for collaborative processes, and those collaborative processes take time to implement. That includes collaborations between institutions, but it also means that you can't flip a switch and have CSU operate totally differently than it currently is, because there needs to be meaningful engagement, as we have tried to do in our work, with faculty, staff, students, others throughout the system. You can't just borrow a a solution from another state, because the Connecticut and every other state we've encountered has unique needs and is situated in a unique context. And then, as I sort of already mentioned, there needs to be intentional and active dialogue with stakeholders who will be critical to implementing and the changes in ways that have to be sustainable going forward. So I'll move on to the recommendations part. I'm kind of speeding through this a little bit, so I'm hoping that people are keeping up and are coming up with questions for me as I get closer to the end here. But at the end of the day, we believe that systems in higher education offer some substantial advantages for meeting the needs that we are expecting going forward. And we think that although the system and the CSU system has had some wobbles as it's tried to get its feet under it over its 10 or 12-year history, we think that the system is still the right structural approach for going forward. We think that in order for that to play out, the system office really needs to prioritize how it adds value to the functioning of institutions. It's not just a holding organization for institutions that essentially operates as an approval authority for things that the institutions may or may not want to do, but it actually delivers value to how the institutions function. We think that it needs to bring benefits of scale and coordination among the institutions, so that, for instance, a program that is may only be available at Southern can be offered to students in the northeastern part of the state who might benefit from that program without Eastern or Quinebaug Valley having to create that program on its own. We think that it's important that the system ensure responsiveness to and improve communications with its institutions. One of the things that we heard repeatedly in talking with stakeholders is that communications internally have been fraught over the history of the system. And so improvements and strategic improvements in that area would be really helpful. Institutions routinely say, if they'd only asked us, we could have provided better information about how to address this. The system office, to be fair, says we have asked. So there's clearly some miscommunications that need to be improved. We think that, there's a need to really improve the stewardship of taxpayer and student investments. And so the system requires investment, but the investment in the ways in which it delivers benefits and creates potential savings should be revenue positive in the end. It's hard to assess that, but there needs to be clarity about how real careful decisions about how to invest money are being made. And then the system really needs more muscular accountability. And as I said, I think that there's been some improvement in that in recent months as new board leadership has taken over. That needs to continue. We also think that it's important that there be a new statewide coordinating board. This is the second of those options that we mentioned, and to fold OHE and its administrative functions into the new entity. I know there are a lot of political feasibility questions about that, but we think that that would be the most ideal arrangement for Connecticut to adopt. Then we made some recommendations for the system office specifically, and it begins with Western Connecticut State University, which has been struggling since the mid-2015s, when it had a reserves level of 20-something million dollars that over the subsequent 6 or so years actually went negative, and it's continued to struggle. This is a situation that I think raises serious credibility issues for the system to not have resolved, to have allowed to occur. Again, new leadership is in place and with the board, but I think that it's vital that Western's challenges get solved once and for all for the system office. So I would put that as the highest priority for the system to really focus its attention on. So the second one is really to clarify those roles and responsibilities that really distinguish what the system needs to do from what the institutions need to do. And looking for opportunities really to create complementarity, reduce duplication, improve communication, and create a virtuous functioning feedback loop. I won't go through all of the items on this table that follows, but those are really to sort of identify, okay, these are things the system does, these are things the institutions need to do. It's important to, everyone around the table recognizes that the system itself has no students currently, and the institutions do. And system itself has no faculty, and the institutions do. So that fundamentally changes the way in which the system should think about operating differently from the institutions. And the structures that exist at institutions don't necessarily translate into structures that exist at a system level. There's been a decision not to replicate a provost at the system level in the months during which period we worked on this project. That's the kind of thing that we highlight as being useful to not do in trying to differentiate those roles. A provost does a certain kind of thing in an institution. There isn't a need for a provost at the system level. We also believe that that there's a need, and I've read many of the headlines, including quotes from members of this advisory board that I think are right to raise questions about whether or not the system has sufficient staffing. And when we look at the data, we think that there is as I've said, a misalignment of the personnel deployment with the needs in number, as well as in where and how the jobs are organized. But I think the solution to that, and what I've read in the report, has been a little bit more reporting has been a little bit less strategic than we would have described it. And so when we think about the staffing needs of the system, we think about them in the context of a strategic plan and a strategic direction. What are the programs that you need? What programs are you going to stop offering that are not needed? Same thing for services that are provided by the staff, by staffing. The staffing plans that we're calling for here are around trying to bring staffing into alignment with budgetary realities and future projections of enrollment. That being said, those decisions need to be done in a very strategic way around the kinds of services and programs that need to be offered. And so I wanted to make that point as clearly as I could, given the kind of reporting that we've seen in the wake of our reports release a couple weeks ago. We also think that the system office needs to be reorganized to better align its structure with the functions it needs to perform, as I described earlier. I think it's worthwhile to really take a look at the positions and ask the question about whether or not they're aligned with the distinct system roles that the system really need to be performing. And I know there's been a salary study for the system in the last 5 to 10 years. It's probably timely to think about doing that again with a better sense of what those distinct roles should be. We think we also think that there's value in really thinking through the separate services organization that we identified as one of the options. Such an organization would be governed by the institutional presidents or their designees and some others to ensure that the needs of the institutions are really elevated to a high level in organizing that. We think that there's some quasi-market that needs to be created around how that works. There are some examples of organizations like this in higher education. They mostly exist in the private nonprofit space as institutions without direct state funding, who are largely, almost entirely tuition dependent, are looking for ways to make their activities more efficient. And so it doesn't happen as often in the public sector. Because I think of the expectation that the state will come to the rescue of a public institution, and because there is a foundational support that comes from the state subsidy. But in the private sector, there are multiple examples of this that I think has helped some of the institutions that are members of it make their value proposition more clear to students. We think that in setting up personnel policies, especially at Connecticut State, as a single institution now, there needs to be a way to maximize the flexibility so that faculty members can teach here and they can also teach at this other place where the enrollment demand is coming from. There needs to be some efforts around professional development within the system across almost all levels around effective personnel management. There's too often a inadequate support for personnel decisions that need to be made and that we've uncovered in the course of this work. And so helping leaders at the institutional level know what they can do within the bounds of the collective bargaining agreements and what they must do within those bounds in order to address problematic personnel is an important thing to work on. We think that the way in which the funds are appropriated to the system and then allocated from the system to the institution can be improved so that incentives that are aligned to state needs are elevated as a higher priority. As part of that, I think there's a need to really look at the board policy on reserves. There's a graph in our report that shows that the CSU reserves have increased dramatically during the period of the federal stimulus. And, you know, we think that's important for the institutions to have adequate reserves. On the other hand, the way that those reserves can be invested to create these kinds of strategic changes is an area where there's room for improvement. The system office really needs to provide guidance to institutions on budget development and implementation in ways that ways that can be improved. We have offered some thoughts on that in the report. Obviously, and it comes a little bit late in these recommendations, but a real important element of the role that the system plays is to establish policies and procedures that help boost student outcomes by smoothing their paths among institutions, gaining access to the kinds of courses that they need in a timely manner, making college more affordable, in creating ways in which the curriculum is infused with work-based learning opportunities as well as skill building. Those are all activities that the system, that I think that the institutions and some departments within institutions do, that needs to be a much more common and coordinated activity by the system across the whole enterprise so that things that are found to work really well can spread quickly through the rest of the system. We talked a little bit earlier about data. It's important that the system begin contributing data regularly to P20 WIN. And also we suggest that the system office report its data to IPEDS. Most system offices do that. CSU has not been. So there's a lack of information about how the system office is comparable to other institutions in the process of not having that data. We think that the activities that the board has undertaken, working with consultants like AGB to ensure that those volunteer board members have the real sense of exactly how they can best be most effective in terms of training, in terms of orientation, in terms of a real effective independent board performance evaluation process. Those are really important activities for the board. And then as part of that, really to try to clarify the specific things that the board really needs to be able to say, yeah, before this goes forward, we need to be able to have a clear conversation about those topics and approve them. Finally, developing a clear plan, as I mentioned before, for how Charter Oak can best be leveraged is an element going forward. And I do know that the board chair has has created a committee that is looking at that last question. Although it really wasn't in the scope of work for us to make recommendations to the state, we regularly find that, as we have here, that there are things that the state could change to make the sort of the ground more fertile for the success of CSU and probably for higher education more generally. And so we made some recommendations to the state as well. First one is establishing that statewide coordinating agency. The second one is to develop a strategic plan for higher education. We do know that at the same time, the legislature appropriated money to do this study, they also appropriated money to the legislature to conduct a strategic plan, and we think that that work is appropriate and should go forward. We think that the funding model for higher education also needs to change so that the block grants that go to CSU and also the funding that goes to Charter Oak and to Connecticut State, and the funding that goes to the private institutions, the financial aid programs, and UConn are all organized under a conceptual design that is better fitted to the needs of the future than the current one, which is focused on largely growth at all times and doesn't really encourage, it doesn't really create incentives for meeting the state's needs. We also, this is a delicate one, but we also believe that, and we heard from leaders throughout the system that the degree to which the back and forth between the system, OPM, the governor's office, and the legislature about how much funding is coming to the system has that tension gets resolved at the end of the day by the infusion of additional cash that the legislature has cobbled together from somewhere else. And I know everybody at the system and to some degree that's connected to the system is glad for that. What we heard from the parties is that it creates a set of incentive that makes it hard for leaders to really help create change. If the belief is that the legislature is not going to let there be actually a gap of whatever the amount is at the end of the day, then there's a sense that it's harder to move people off of their positions and into ways that might actually meet students' needs more effectively and be more affordable for the state and for students. We think that that CSU needs to have some expectations in the capital budgeting process and a rubric that is aligned with state goals so that both CSU as an organization can, when it's asked to put forward its request to the capital budget, it's already gone through a prioritization process that's based on a rubric that's aligned to state goals. And OPM can also exercise and use a similar rubric for allocating funds to CSU as well. An important part of that we've made into this document is that there should be some, we think it's wise to put a moratorium on the creation of new net square footage within CSU until CSU can really understand at a detailed level how its space currently exists, how it's being used, and develop plans for going forward that are aligned with its strategic goals so that those prioritization processes can fit within the context of those things. We think that the challenges that have faced CSU's board are not limited to CSU's board, and a requirement for training of all public institutions board members would be a useful thing in the climate we are in. And it would certainly ensure that CSU's board is attending to its own needs to be effective as well. The seventh one is here primarily because it's too simple to look at the number of employees in the system office and say, and if it grows, and say that's bad. If the system office is delivering value and helping to create scale, it may be the case that it will need to grow in smart ways. And so I think that it's really important to look at the staffing levels and the costs associated with the system office in light of the degree to which it's an efficient, value-driven organization going forward, not just how many individuals it employs. We think the state could benefit from a policy audit, and a policy audit of the kind where a question is, for example, if we look at those demographic data and we see that the path forward for CSU's enrollment trajectory to improve it is adult learners to some degree, a question is, does your state financial aid programs really support the needs of adult learners who might be interested in enrolling in higher education so that they can attend? Quite often that's not the case. So you would look for the interaction of various different policies under a policy audit to make sure that they aren't working at cross purposes with one another. And then finally, it's timely for Connecticut to develop and enact a statewide policy to support dual enrollment. As I conclude, I just want to say up front that, NCHEMS believes the data indicate CSU institutions are critical to the future of Connecticut. There is evidence to suggest that those institutions, specifically in public comprehensives in other states as well as community colleges, the graduates from those institutions are more likely to be your state residents, and they're more likely to remain in your state and work than some of the other institutions that sit within your borders. And so these are vital institutions for meeting the workforce needs of the future. It's also the case that institutions like the CSU institutions typically enroll disproportionately high numbers of low-income adults, underrepresented minorities, first-generation students, and the like. And it's really critical that those access points, as well as the success of the students once they gain access to these institutions, are effective. One of the things we also heard throughout the conversations, and that we see, and was part of the AAUP response to our report, and we see it in other places and maybe didn't come across as clearly in our study, is that the needs of students who are more likely to be low income or first generation, or do not have strong support networks, or have struggled to adapt to the changes in how we live and learn, especially in the wake of the pandemic. Those individuals, to be successful, might need different kinds of services than what has been traditionally offered. I'm not certain that they all cost more necessarily, but there definitely are going to be some costs associated with transforming to meet the needs of students, to really understand them and to adapt services to meet those needs. The second point I'd make is that an effective system is really, I think, an effective system is really an opportunity to optimize efficiency and to ensure access. This report and the role that the system takes should not simply be about efficiency. It should also be about adding value and creating opportunities to access programs that might not otherwise be financially sustainable in all parts of the system, but to ensure that the mobility of student credits and student experiences can be unleashed. Changes to make the system into that effective organization are really necessary and urgent. And I think that finally the state can really improve the coordination of the policy environment in which CSU operates, so that it is more likely to be effective. And with that, I'm happy to shut my screen down and take questions. But if we need to go back to it, I can bring it back up.
Thank you, Mr. Prescott. Very comprehensive, thoughtful. I appreciate all the hard work that went into this. I'm going to be respectful of folks' time. We've got about 55 minutes remaining. Are there questions? I think Senator Austin has some questions.
Thank you very much. And I also appreciate the information that's here. I just have a couple of questions relative to national trends. And you talked a lot about student population. Are the national trends in any way related to the overall cost of higher education, where young people are making a decision to not seek higher education just relative to the cost that it will have on their future? Have you done any work relative to that?
There is evidence that suggests that increases in net costs, are likely to lead to lower levels of enrollment, particularly among low-income populations. So that is a concern. I think that the cost question has gotten. I also think, and I can't tell you this for Connecticut off the top of my head, but the net prices have actually improved in recent years, according to some of the research I have found. So although the tuition's going up, some of the financial aid that's backfilling that for some of the students has offset those increases in tuition. And a report came out just recently this week that shows the state-funded financial aid has increased at the largest percentage rate in I can't remember how long, just since in between 2022 and 2023, I believe. So all this is a little bit dated. I also think that the cost question isn't just a cost question anymore. It's much more a question of value. And so folks are willing to pay for things they believe are going to pay off in the future. But we've been having a lot of conversations recently about whether or not a bachelor's degree is necessary, in what programs, and so forth, that I think are starting to confound the simple question of whether or not tuition's gone up and therefore students are less likely to enroll.
And expounding upon that, in the interest of people's time, and I'm sure everybody has their couple of questions relative to that issue. When you said a report came out on cost, was that a national report that talked about the different states and where Connecticut is in? If that's the case, can you send us that report?
I will look for that.
And when you talk about the value, I guess automatically incorporate the value of an education in with where a bachelor's degree fits in with a certain job class. And how does that is someone going to get out of a college environment with X debt, and how are they going to move into the next step of their future? Getting married and having children and buying a home or buying anything or traveling or whatever they so choose to do. It seems to me that many people are taking into account what their actual job will be in the future and what their salary will be in the future related to the debt that they incur. Is that something that you have any data on?
I think that there is evidence that suggests that increasing debt has negative implications on increasing student debt has caused people to delay some of those kinds of decisions that you're describing, Senator. I do think, and I'm not trying to suggest that cost is not a factor. I'm just saying that that the increasing focus on what the workforce outcomes of a particular program are, I think, have attracted the attention of prospective students in ways that is more common than it used to be.
Thank you for that, because this is something that I've really been pondering for a long time on whether the people in my district, predominantly low income, I find a lot of young people are hesitant to take that chance. But I will sit and listen to everybody else's comments because I think everybody's going to have a different perspective, and I like hearing other people's opinions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Other questions? Representative Walker.
Thank you. And thank you, Brian, for your presentation. I think the detail that you provided, especially the historical background of how we got to where we are now, was extremely important, because we forget some of the different steps that we've done in Connecticut to address it. I want to start with, in the beginning of your report, you talked about the traditional student, and you talked about how the traditional student numbers are going down. But I think that I want to zero in on that category of traditional student. Connecticut has demonstrated, especially with our CSU system and our CT State, that we are attracting more non-traditional students. So did you take that into account, those non-traditional students, or was it just a term that you were using? That threw me off. So could you explain that?
Yeah. So when I'm talking about traditional age, I'm talking about traditional age students in this particular case. Those traditional age students, if you look at if you unpack what the composition of them, they are increasingly also likely to be underrepresented minorities. They may be new Americans. When we did our work at Western a couple of years ago, we were finding out that the population of Danbury, Connecticut, where Western is, substantially changing. Lots of Brazilians are relocating to Danbury. frankly, we found that the attention that Western was giving to the Danbury High School was not nearly what it could be. And so I think there are opportunities for CSCU institutions to lean in a little harder to some of the populations that are not as well represented in higher education. I am simply saying, however, that um, that compositional issue is an issue that we all need to understand, and higher education and policy needs to support the success of those students. Um, and they will still form the more predictable foundation of what comes to college. And so it'll be critical. Um, the thing that I worry about, and having worked in Vermont, where the demographic conditions are even more stark than in Connecticut and New Hampshire, is there are just the same number of institutions with the same needs to enroll students, and fewer students of whatever type that are within that age range that we are used to serving as full-time students in residence halls Monday through Friday during the day. And I think that there's that the institutions are going to compete heavily for those students, and there are just not enough of them to go around. That isn't to say that college going rates can't be improved, and that college going rates among those populations in particular can't be or shouldn't be improved. It's just that we're all going to be fighting over all of them, and some institutions are going to be able to make a better case than others, and those institutions institutions need to be clear about their mission and how they're carrying out that mission to serve those populations and other populations who could benefit from higher education.
Thank you. And just on that same note, when you talked about, the different things that affected the attendance of new students to the CSU system, did you you did mention the fact about the 4 satellites that UConn developed around the state of Connecticut. And in your numbers, did you put that factor in there as something that would affect the CSU system, and you took into account how we can collaborate with that? I did hear you mention, but I didn't hear much detail on it.
Right. So the UConn's branch campuses, we did do some research on them. I'm trying to remember what we didn't include necessarily all of it in the report. Certainly the report was, I think, long enough as it was, but this store is not so much, but the branch campuses are often enrolling students that share a lot of similar characteristics with the students that enroll, say, at Southern. And to the degree that students see that they get a degree from UConn with UConn on it, that might be more appealing to some of them. And so those branch campuses are competing for that same dwindling population of students. I do have some concerns about that. I don't know that it's right or wrong, but I do think that it's the kind of thing that policy coordination entity should take up and have a conversation that's strategic with the legislature, the governor's office, with the leaders of those institutions. And I would just point to Penn State as an example of what might happen. They have 23 so-called Commonwealth campuses scattered around the state that are competing with private nonprofits and with the state system universities and even with community colleges. And there's not enough data on whether or not those institutions are or are not making money, not data available to the state. It's available to Penn State leadership. But Penn State leadership has decided recently that there's too many of them and that they need to roll it back. And I think that's I'm not suggesting that that's the future for UConn. We didn't study UConn. All I'm simply saying is that there's enough overlap in the types of students that the branch campuses are enrolling and what CSUs and CT State are enrolling, that there's questions about whether or not there's enough students to go around, and particularly when you add in the nonprofits in Connecticut.
I think that was the real point that I was trying to make, because the other part of it is, as you pointed out, was the graduating rates for the high schools, which obviously have made a big turn down and have affected where the students are. So as we look at this, I think that's very important that we take in all the factors and then come up with an analysis of how do we shape the CSCU system and CT State to blend in with UConn so that they don't compete as much, but blend together, but still have their separate identities. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'll save my other questions if anybody else does. So with that.
Thank you, Representative Walker. I think Representative Nuccio has her hand up.
Yes, I do. My first quick question is for you, Jeff. I was wondering, are we going to do this same analysis on UConn that we just did on the CSCUs?
The mandate here for this particular ARPA allocation was to do a study of the Connecticut State Colleges and Universities. UConn's had some recent studies done with perhaps a different focus, but this one, the charge here, the scope of work here was for the Connecticut State Colleges and Universities.
Okay. I'd be very interested to see what UConn looks like with this same sort of analysis. And then, Brian, I have a couple of questions for you, if that's okay. I was looking at the slide that was comparing enrollment and staffing, and you mentioned that the CSCU staffing has gone down 27%, staff only 10, and non-instructional staff only 10 also, which indicates that, you know, we're probably not reducing staff in line with what we're seeing from enrollment. But I was really wondering if there was a full review of the non-instructional staff. I have had a few people who've worked in the systems mention to me that there was back probably around the 2015 timeframe through, you know, increases in non-instructional staff, especially at UConn. And I'm wondering if there's any sort of review out there to show the whys and hows of it, right? If they're non-instructional staff and they're going up and, you know, they're not coming down with the enrollment and such, how does that, you know, that impacts the cost of education. So is there any more thorough review of the non-instructional staff, reductions in that, or, you know, pros and cons of having that with a reducing enrollment?
So we did only a little bit deeper analysis on those data that are in here. It's very complicated to, at least for to do comparable data. I will say that, you know, it is true that both of those numbers have fallen, just not relative to enrollment. And I will also say that I get a little worried about the kind of things. So in the West, we have a lot of ballot initiatives. One of those things that we get to see is like, we're going to raise your sales tax by 0.3%, and all of that money is going to go to K-12 instruction only in the classroom. And I'm not always convinced that we are in the best position to really determine what belongs in the classroom and what doesn't. And so when I look at the makeup of the student body that's coming to your institutions, I think that it's really important that they have good mentors and that among the faculty, but they also have the right kind of support services. The non-instructional category includes the kind of advising and counseling and student support personnel that are needed to really help supplement the activities that are happening in the classroom by the faculty to be successful, and even around how do you ensure that that students that are being asked to be functional online but haven't had a lot of background and experience in that can really do that effectively. And so but that line also includes administrators, and some of those administrators are potentially superfluous. Some of them are there because regulatory requirements have mandated the creation of them. So all of which is to say, I don't have a ton of additional detail. I think it's important that we have good, committed faculty, and many of the faculty at CSCU, I'm convinced, are in that category. I also think that the non-instructional group is a diverse collection of folks. So as I said about the system office, we should be careful as we think about the right numbers in the right categories there for that. I would just simply say that that overall there appears to be a lot more employees relative to the students, and so thinking about how to bring that into appropriate alignment with enrollment demand is part of the staffing plan challenge that I think that we highlighted as being important for CSU to undertake.
Thank you. I think that's kind of what I was getting at, is that there's all different kinds of people that are in that non-instructional staff. And how do we parse out, not to sound crass, but like the useful and, like you said, the superfluous, the ones that, maybe we don't need 5 of these, maybe we need this. And I was also thinking about one of your suggestions with reviewing kind of like the back office thing and looking for consolidation opportunities, and that we might have that same sort of opportunity in the non-instructional for some of those positions where we have 5 or 6 of, say, these like administrators or something that we might not need. Maybe we can look for a combination there to have them oversee more than one school, right? So that's kind of
Right.
what I'm looking for.
Yeah, and I think that
Not the non-instructional that is directly interacting per se with the children, they're not children. I hate it when people refer to them as children, but as
Right.
with these adult learners' needs. But the ones that don't do that, how do we consolidate and kind of bring those together for economic purposes?
Right. And I think that there are some ways to do that. And I think it comes down to like, you know, how do you figure out what are the system-wide policies that need to be exercised, and how do you aggregate specialties so that financial aid is a good example. The student, when I'm a student and I come to the financial aid office on campus, I can get 80 to 90% of my questions answered by that generalist that's right there in front of me.
Mhm.
And when I ask a question about something really confusing, the value of my farm, my working farm, they can get an answer in relatively fast order on something where they don't have to know everything about, all aspects of the complexity of financial aid, but can get an answer quickly from that central authority. As institutions evolved over that period of 30 years, there was no reason to try to aggregate that, really, because institutions could just do whatever they needed to do. There was always more students. And I think as we look ahead, there's a need to be thoughtful about how do we, without taking everybody and sticking them in the system office and saying, you go to work in New Britain or you go to work in 61 Woodlawn. Instead, you might still be at, Eastern, and you might still be serving students, but a portion of your time is really because you're an expert on, the assessment of farm and its use in financial aid. You're available to all the institutions throughout the system, and you have an expectation to be responsive in a certain amount of time to the questions that come to you that way.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm looking at and thinking about in that perspective. And I did recognize, you said that there was fear from the CSCUs in the political aspect of it. If they say, oh, we're going to reduce 10% of our staff, people throw up their arms and we're denying this and we're denying that, and it's I think that's the political rhetoric that comes along with it without really thinking about the fiscal responsibility. So I recognize their fear of that. The other thing that I had is in relation to the statewide coordination, this role, I guess I'm trying to figure out, I'm fiscally conservative and looking at this saying, we want to create a new office, right? That always puts me back on my heels because we have OHE, and OHE is not cheap. It's not inexpensive. And so I guess I'm trying to see if you can maybe delineate between what would you expect differently? Because whether it's creating a new system and rolling OHE into it, that's just adding more cost, right? Unless it's just OHE with different directives, which keeps the same cost and just makes them kind of fine tune what they're looking at. I'm trying to see why would we need a whole new organization? Why would we need a whole new, level of employees to look at something that we have OHE to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so I did not have the version of the report up. So I'm trying to pull that up right now because in it is one of the appendices talks about all the various functions that are executed by the Oregon Higher Education Coordinating Commission.
Oregon?
Oregon's, yep. And Oregon created that at the same time they dismantled the system that they had for their four-year institutions because they recognized that letting the institutions run free there would be no one there in the state infrastructure to sort of look after the goals of the state with the level of expertise that's needed to manage this for the for post-secondary education. So it's Appendix E, and
Appendix E.
yeah, and what I would say about that is that it outlines a whole series of things that nobody's doing in Connecticut. And so sure, the CSU system office does some of these things for its institutions, and its primary constituency, well, at least it's confused very often about its constituency between the state's goals and the goals of the institutions, their faculty, their students, and so on. And this entity that we're describing does something beyond what OHE does that's not being done by anybody else in the states. UConn's the same way. They have a public purpose. I'm not diminishing that, but it's got its own institutional interests are not always going to be in alignment with what the needs of the state are. And so, for example, OPM, its role is to sort of put the governor's budget together. It happens to have somebody in the undersecretary's role that I've worked with very closely for the last, year, who is a former institutional CFO and knows higher education funding pretty well. But when there's not somebody with that background in that role, let's say they're from K-12 a background or transportation or just business generally, and they take that job, they don't know how higher education works, and it's really vital to have that policy leadership around how the state should strategically fund the enterprise. And so all of the enterprises, and so this entity that we're talking about is trying to ensure that the legislature and the governor's office, OPM, and others are operating with the most capable counsel possible around something that's as complex as higher education funding. But it's not just that; it's also where are the programs. It's also what's the statewide plan. It's also let's instead of just managing the financial aid programs, let's build recommendations for how those financial aid programs should shift. OHE doesn't do those things to the same degree that we think a state really would benefit from. Most of the states in the country that have either they have a system or they have a coordinating agency, and even states recently that don't are starting to realize the need for it. So Pennsylvania is adopting one, Wisconsin's thinking about it. And so I think that I agree with you. You don't just create bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake. So I think that this list that's that we provide from Oregon, not all of them will fit Connecticut, but it gives you an indication. You can look and see, do we have an entity that really does that? And you'll find a lot of gaps.
Okay, I'm definitely interested in looking at that and seeing what it is. Sorry,
Okay.
my dog is barking. And I
Representative
have
Newcomb,
another
I'll let-
question, but I'll wait and let everybody else go before I
There
come
you
back.
go. Good idea. Other questions? Corey, Representative Parrish, excuse me.
I'll go by Corey today. Thank you. Only you, Secretary Beckham, can say that. The chairs of approps cannot. Just teasing. No laughter. Okay, so 2 questions that I have here. I would like to focus on enrollment, which I think has been a theme that we have talked about throughout the last few questions. About 10 to 20% of out-of-state students make up the population for other institutions across the country, which I think is pretty admirable. I think that's also, for a lot of those students, they're taking on remote positions, and so they're doing online courses or they're moving to the campuses. For us, we've seen enrollment go up at some of the institutions, public institutions like UConn, but they've gone down exponentially at any of the CSUs and then also Charter Oak. So for me, it's a net migration issue, which was mentioned in the report. My question is what are we doing to help offset some of those trends moving forward? Because I do believe, we've got about 13,000 students that are considered out-of-state students in our public institutions in the CSCU system. What are we doing to try to attract more students from outside the country, from across the country, to come to our institutions and not heavily rely on the students who are already living here and are homegrown?
So I would say that so again, the focus of our study was on CSCU, and most of those institutions aren't really engaged very much in the out-of-state market. Western is more so than the others because it's so close to the New York border, and because Dutchess County and Putnam County in New York are not there isn't a nearer institution than Western. So some years ago, Western got permission to offer essentially, I think it's in-state resident rates to those New York students because they're part of Western service area. And so they get a number of those. Most of the interstate mobility that you're talking about, and you can see that in one of the graphs I showed, really happens with the public flagships and the private nonprofits. And I think that states are wise to think about the degree to which they are a net importer and net exporter, where the students are enrolling when they come, and especially how do you retain them once they graduate? Because a lot of those individuals that come show up and then they go back to where they started from to find employment. And so I think that the other thing I would say, Representative Paris, is part of what you should recognize in the question is that it's more of this activity may or may not happen, but the degree to which institutions will try to recruit students from beyond their borders is almost inevitably going to increase. There are multiple incentives already for them to do that. And if there's diminishing numbers of high school graduates within the state, and that's who they typically serve, they're going to look beyond their borders. But New York's seeing a big decline, Vermont's seeing a big decline, Massachusetts is going to be down. It costs more on average to recruit a student from across the border into your institution. There's questions of the degree to which the mission of the institution is about serving students from around the country and around the world that aren't the same for UConn as they are for Eastern Connecticut or Southern. So I think that those are, back to Representative Nuccio's question, I think those are real questions that deserve to have a hearing in the full view of the public, supported by data and information. I actually think that CSCU institutions' mission is really to serve the needs of Connecticut residents who would not otherwise be able to afford out-of-state tuition and or UConn.
And I appreciate that. And so, Mr. Secretary, I don't have a second question, but a comment that I think is important for us to focus on is the young people who are going to school and the adult learners who are coming to our state institutions. We definitely need to keep them here. But I do believe, based on the P20 model of us looking and focusing on the data and the population trends from K-12 into the college system, of us needing to put more money into the marketing of our institutions across the country. I mean, I get more ads coming from USC to try to get me to go into a master's program, and I don't even have to step foot in the state of California, but for one time a semester. I think that Connecticut has a lot to offer, and I think that if other schools are seeing their populations rise in terms of enrollment, we should be able to do the exact same thing, because we are in a corridor that has a financial sector, that has a high corporate sector, that has a great nonprofit sector, and we have a high quality of life. So, I think if we're absolutely putting money into the investment, we deserve to make sure that these CSUs have the best resources put forth to help get the enrollment up. And I think that we need to, obviously, to your point, build a narrative and also have a public forum in which we talk about how we move forward in being able to do that. So I just want to implore us to be thinking about that to help offset some of these challenges that we are facing as a system moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Other questions from the board at this time? Senator, Representative Haddad.
Thank you. And thank you for your presentation. The report, 200 pages of good reading. I spent a couple of times sort of trying to work through this, and I have, lots and lots of questions, but I'm going to keep this at a fairly high level. I want to say, first off, that I think that one of the recommendations that you make that I hope that we really embrace is around development of a strategic plan for higher education. You were involved in 2015, you referenced this in your remarks with when Roberta Willis was the chair of the Higher Education Committee with an effort to develop a strategic plan for the state. That is now, about 10 years out of date. I think it would be a breath of fresh air if even the people who are on this committee sort of could agree on a common set of goals about what we want out of our system of public and frankly also our private institutions. Like what do we want to create in Connecticut in order to meet our state needs and the needs of students in Connecticut? I'm not sure we agree right now, frankly. I think that there's probably if you asked us, we would each give you a different question. A different answer to the question. One thing that I look to in order to get to answer that question is actually I look to our state constitution. I don't know how many constitutions reference specifically an expectation for a post-secondary system. Ours does. It specifically says that we should have a system of higher education that's dedicated to excellence. And I think about what that means. And when we all take an oath of office, we pledge our allegiance to the Constitution. And I wonder, I would hope that we would all take that pledge seriously, that what we're striving for is an excellent system of post-secondary education in Connecticut. To me, that is measurable by, you could measure by outcomes. And I think about if there was a disappointment I had with the report is that we didn't spend a lot of time in the report sort of outlining goals or expectations for student outcomes. That might have been out of the scope of the charge. I see this primarily as a budget report. This is how do we, budget and governance, and not one that's focused much on student outcomes. Completion rates, retention rates, measures of student success post-graduation. What are the employer's demands in Connecticut right now, and how do we achieve them? And one of the risks I think that we run is that we fail to, as we're thinking about downsizing our system, as you contemplate here, is that we already know that there are employer demands that we're not meeting. And so I don't know how we meet employer and state demands when we're shrinking the size of the system and not doing the aggressive enrollment strategies that I think Corey was just talking about. I'm sorry, Representative Paris. Do I get to go?
That makes Secretary Beckham and Representative.
Right. And so I guess my question to you is just around the strategic plan for higher education. We had budgeted some money to do a strategic plan, and you and I actually had a conversation at one point about what it would take in order to do that. You were involved in the original strategic plan. We need to do an update. Unfortunately, that money was eliminated when we adopted the budget last year, and so we're left without. But is that traditionally how does a strategic plan get developed? Is that something that gets put together, sort of on an ad hoc basis as we did 10 years ago, or is that a responsibility of what you would envision, an initial responsibility of the statewide coordinating agency?
Yeah, I think to answer that specific question, a major important role of the statewide coordinating agency would be to establish a strategic plan, monitor it, renew it when the time comes, make adjustments as conditions warrant, like COVID, for example. And so I think that all those questions that you're asking about there need to be part of that dialogue. And as I said, when we were engaging in our stakeholder activities, we did talk with employers, identified primarily by the institutions. And I think a more broader engagement with the employment community and various industry that as a more focused point of the strategic planning activity should be part of that strategic planning activity. If it's a statewide, whether it's an outside consultant, which may or may not be useful in with or without the presence of a statewide coordinating agency, But with the coordinating agency, they're having their hand on the pulse of, what those different industries that Representative Harris mentioned really need, and figuring out which of the organizational structures that best ensure that those needs can be met, I think is important part of how that goes forward. I will say that while without being defensive, while we did include graphs and charts on some of the outcomes related matters that you mentioned, it was not as much a focus of the report that we wrote. And to the degree that was a missed opportunity, I apologize. I do think that as I said, that there needs to be some assessment of how the needs of students are changing as well, and what kinds of supports they need. But it's just too simple to say we need more of the same thing. And I think that there's enough evidence to suggest that what students actually need are some different kinds of supports, even supports for faculty to help them ensure that the kind of education they're delivering in the classroom and online, sometimes at the same time, sometimes supplementally, is really meeting the needs of students. I think that those are, we're starting to, COVID put everybody online, and not everybody did it well. And I think that there's some real value in trying to figure out how to ensure that students' needs are being met through the new way in which we're educating people. That wasn't really a critical part of the work that we did, but I think it would go to the questions of how students are experiencing and benefiting from higher education in the system.
Yeah, I appreciate your response. It just seems to me that a conversation about what we should be investing in public higher education without a recognition that it is tied to some extent to the outcomes of what we get, and a common set of goals, makes it difficult. It all becomes somewhat arbitrary, and I think that that's why many of your recommendations also talk about funding. Establishing a more rational basis, I think, for determining what the funding level should be at our institutions that are based on outcomes. And you actually talk about two different funding models. I'm familiar with outcome-based funding models. My only comment to that, I guess, would be that one of the limitations I see in outcome-based funding models is that it doesn't guarantee to the institutions elevated support. It just changes the way we divide the support that's available. And so we could be reducing, in fact, the total amount that we're appropriating to support public higher education at the same time that we're changing the way that we divide that up based on whether or not institutions are meeting their goals or not, right? There is no... when I think about the state budget, I think this is a big surprise for a lot of folks. It's not always the most rational document. It's rational to extent, but also a measure of political will and power to determine how we're allocating money. And so there have been lots of examples. Just to say this briefly, a number of years ago, Governor Malloy set up a goal of increasing the number of STEM graduates from the University of Connecticut. And there was a promise of additional resources over a number of years. The university began investing money in that process. In fact, began meeting their goals to increase the number of STEM graduates. But guess what? Like, the state never appropriated the money to meet the obligation. And so can you talk a little bit about whether or not that's a significant barrier to enable to adopting outcome-based funding models? Is the total amount that we invest an important component of following through on the promises made?
So yes, I think that's true. I think that particularly with relation to outcomes-based funding, I think that the concept behind that is really, really interesting and potentially powerful. I think the implementation of it has left some weaknesses that have caused it to become, the research on it suggests really mixed outcomes. The approach that we think that Connecticut and other states ought to consider as they look ahead is really a combination of asking questions about how adequately is the enterprise funded, to meet to deliver the kinds of programs that have that they themselves have varied costs, as well as the kinds of students that are being served with their varied costs of bringing them to success. And adding some performance elements that exist on top of that, so that the performance funding model creates, it's built on a relatively solid level of funding support that the institution understands is tied to, program costs to some degree and student costs, and a little bit for the overall, overhead costs of running the entire enterprise. Those kinds of elements, I think, give institutions the ability to know from year to year, we know we're going to get this. We understand how we can, how our funding level would likely change on the basis of some of these kinds of calculations. And then you move forward and say, in order to improve, to meet some of these targets that have been specified in the outcomes-based portion of the allocation, these are the things that we're going to try to make that work. I think we've got a pretty solid conceptual framework for that. I think there's more than one. We're not the only organization right now out there talking about adequacy in funding modeling. But I think that's the angle that I think helps ensure that the institutions get the right messages about what is valuable to the state, what the state's funding them for. It creates space for a conversation around, okay, if these are the costs, what share of these costs should be covered by students and their tuition payments, and what share should be covered by states? And, how do we differentiate the institutions reasonably on the basis of their mission? And so I hope that's responsive to your question, Representative Haddad, but I think that it would be a mistake to put too many eggs in the funding basket. But I think at the moment there's not hardly any at all in Connecticut's. And so I think that, creating the opportunity to use finance policy to steer the performance and what institutions are doing is neglected currently. And I think there's strategies that would help move the state in a more constructive direction.
I know my colleagues have additional questions, and so I'm going to hold a couple. If there's time at the end, maybe I'll ask some more, but thank you very much for your responses.
Thank you. Senator Flexer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. I am going to try to ask a few quick questions. First being just technical about the report. In Figure 4, with the college going rates, does that take into account students who may be taking a gap year? Is that any component of the decline that we're seeing?
It could be, but I think that the numbers of students, I don't have data on how many students take a gap year, but I don't think that it's sufficient to account for the significance of these declines. But generally speaking, if I take a gap year and there are more students taking gap years, then that would help account for one of the decline, a portion of that decline. Yes.
Do you think that's like 2%, 5%?
I don't know that I have any good data to say. I would be surprised if it's I would be stunned if essentially college going rates level and all of that is due to gap years.
Okay, thank you. And then do you have any information from other states or best practices in terms of how to change college going rates? And are there other states that are doing it well?
I think there are some things that Connecticut could think about that we didn't really address in the report. One of the things that's come up is the degree to which states are expanding their free college program. I know there's one associated with the two-year institutions, the Connecticut State and Connecticut, and the AEP have argued that should be expanded. And another one I think might be more interesting is, some of the efforts around direct admission, that where they're using data to, my niece is a beneficiary of this. My niece applied to no colleges and is enrolled in one because she was automatically admitted on the basis of her not particularly sterling grades and is attending college and thriving, but would not have gone very likely otherwise. And so that's
Where is that?
that's in
Sorry to
Washington
interrupt
State.
you.
Yeah, that's in Washington. There's a bunch of states that are trying to put together these direct admission programs. I don't think it's taken off quite as much in the Northeast as they have in the West. And it would require, careful management of data to do that.
Thank you. I
So
do wonder if
that's one
that's one of our challenges here, is that a disconnect between the K through 12 system and our public higher ed system in particular, and maybe building stronger relationships there could affect these rates.
Part of the dual enrollment policy that you should be thinking about is not just how to allow students to get dual enrollment credit to be more competitive in the admissions game, but also how to those experiences connect the students with the college that they might consider seriously as their post-secondary home for 3 or 4 years after.
That's right. And maybe just thinking out loud here, I don't know that we're quite ready for the wholesale change, but maybe that is something a larger office that looks at higher education could look particularly at that in the short term and build upon that. Just a few more, I'm trying to be quick. I have a lot of questions, but I'm trying to be quick. Where did you get the system office budget, and can you share that with us? Because in the appropriations committee, I have had a hard time ever getting those thorough numbers.
The numbers are you referring to whatever that figure is? It's just a little table in the report.
Yep.
Yeah, those numbers come from that survey that I described that we did with the National Association of Higher Education Systems. I cannot share anything further about those data, unfortunately. I think OPM has considerably more data about the total, at least the expenditures on salary and various other things that might be available. But I think that part of the dilemma here is that but the system office can be a lot more transparent in reporting its data to sources like IPEDS that would allow us to have a better sense of that.
Okay, thank you. Maybe OPM can share that information.
I think salary stuff is in core. I think it's in the comptroller's office. We could probably get that. We'll look into that for sure. Whatever we've got, we can certainly make that available. I'm going to, if we can, conclude the verbal questions. If folks have additional questions, why don't we submit those in writing? We'll try to get answers back to you. Chancellor Chang is here today and wanted a couple minutes to speak to us today. And I thought, if without objection from the board, we'd give him that opportunity in the 7 minutes or so we have left, at least scheduled for today, if that's okay.
Thank you, Secretary Beckham. I appreciate that. And I want to say thank you to NCHEMS. I want to say thank you to the Office of Policy and Management. And thank you to our legislators, our legislative leaders for this work. It's not easy work, right? This is not a comfortable moment. So I want to say out loud that I firmly believe that we are all on the same page. CSU is committed to listening, learning, improving, and doing everything we can to uphold, as Representative Haddad noted, a system of excellence that serves the needs of our students and our state. I wanted to address a couple items. Senator Austin had made a comment or a question about the value of a college degree, and are there factors that show that kind of long-term value. So using the Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce, which is maybe the most respected source for this kind of work nationally, their analysis says consistently that those who earn an associate's degree will ultimately earn $750,000 more across approximately a 30-year career. $750,000 for an associate's degree. A bachelor's degree, you will earn approximately $1.1 million more during your career. And with a master's degree, you will earn approximately $1.4 million more in your career. And I think those data are really important. To Representative Walker's question before about the impact of the University of Connecticut regional campuses, which I led one of those in Stamford for 5.5 years during a time of growth. I think a study of the impact and the kind of cross-pollination or maybe even cannibalization of our student enrollment across the state might be a very valuable study. Anecdotally, I can tell you, having been on both sides, that I believe there is an impact, and I believe there's a significant impact on our system to the negative. And I think that and that is not a criticism of the University of Connecticut, where I have many friends and many colleagues, but I think it is an observation of fact. So I would argue that a study would be valuable. I want to address a few of the broader points. And again, I think Brian and NCHEMS have done some really significant work that I'm very grateful for. I'll talk about Western Connecticut State University first. Western has been in the media and has been at the tops of our minds for a long time now. In my first year as chancellor in 2021, 2022, one of the first major things I did was to non-reappoint the president at that time, because after the study done by NCHEMS and the data that we had reviewed, it was clear that things were dire. And I don't use that word lightly. We are now on our second interim president at Western, and though progress has been made, I want to give the institution credit. They are working hard. The leadership there is working hard. The institution deserves a stable, permanent president. So there is a search happening right now for Western Connecticut State's next permanent president. We are engaged in what I would call an unorthodox, but I think will be a very fruitful partnership with Central Connecticut State University and the system office. Central is one of our highest performing institutions with excellent practices and operations. They are serving as partners and advisors to Western Connecticut State University. And to me, they are not making the decisions at Western. I want to be clear about that. They are not making the decisions at Western. This is not a takeover. This is a partnership. This is a collaboration to try to help Western. We are committed to doing the hard work that is going to be needed to make Western sustainable and viable for the long term. It is too important to the region and too important to the communities and the students there. And they deserve this kind of support that they have not received in the past. The NCHEMS report talks about duplication. As Brian noted, we have eliminated the system office provost position. That was the second highest paid position in the system office. And ultimately, we eliminated that position and we have reorganized so that we can continue to serve our institutions in the academic affairs arena without the duplication of that kind of role. I'm working with the 6 system presidents right now to determine what are the areas that can be shared across the system. Where can we share services? Where can we share resources? And what needs to remain distinct? One of the efforts ongoing right now is with CT State. As we all know, there was a merger of the campuses into one institution, and ultimately a shared services unit was created at the system office. Working with President Maduka, we have determined that that is not optimal for serving our students. We are now unpacking that, and we have moved the HR function back to CT State for them to deploy as they see fit at their campuses. And we think that is a very important crystallizing of what the value of system office can and should do, but also bring these services back to the students directly. The goal for me is to try to make system office smaller, leaner, sharper, stronger. We should not be duplicating. We are going to do everything we can to focus on system-wide process, procedure, protocol, policy, compliance, accountability, and ultimately alignment. I'm going quickly because I know we have time. It's not always great to be the last speaker before lunch, but NCHEMS has a lot of really good recommendations. I really do appreciate the report. So I'll talk about the areas where we are in alignment and we're already doing a certain level of work. I agree with Brian wholeheartedly. CSU is critical to the future success of our state. Vital, I believe, is the word that he used. I could not agree more. There is an opportunity for more market share, as we would say in the business world, for students. We have to bring more students in. Online students, out-of-state students, adult and professional, industry credentials, and we have to improve retention. We have to improve our transfer rates between our community colleges and our universities. As Representative Paris noted, Western currently offers in-state tuition to New York and New Jersey. And we, the system office, worked to pass a policy that allowed the universities to offer the New England Board of Higher Education rate for all out-of-state students in an effort to attract more students from out of state to our universities. But we leave that up to our universities to execute as part of their enrollment strategies. We have to have more accountability, no doubt. I firmly believe we must invest in dual and concurrent enrollment. And we would certainly be happy to work with our state leaders to develop a funding model if that were the direction you would like to go, because it would create transparency and clarity. We want to work to keep costs for our students manageable. That is why in our current biennium proposal, we do not increase tuition for 2 years. We want to hold tuition flat for 2 years because we know that every time we increase tuition, we marginalize the already minoritized and marginalized. We cannot disenfranchise students more. More collaboration across our institutions. Absolutely. It's happening. CT State and Charter Oak are doing work together. Charter Oak and Western Connecticut State are working together. We're going to continue to do more. We need more collaboration with industry and community to meet their needs, no doubt. Charter Oak needs to go to the next level. Charter Oak is maybe the best kept secret in Connecticut. They do an incredible job online and they are ready to serve at an ever higher level. The reason we have not been able to grow Charter Oak is because we have not invested in Charter Oak. And I'm happy to tell you that in the last 2 years, Charter Oak has increased their enrollment by double digits, right? And that is because we have been increasing their budget and they have been creating new programs and effecting better and more intense enrollment strategies. We would look forward to a conversation around a rubric for capital projects that would help clarify our positioning and our arguments to the state that we believe that our capital projects are of value to be invested in. I really believe that this is an opportunity, and Representative Haddad said this. Can we come together and crystallize what we expect as the goals and the outcomes for our public higher education entities? Because I do believe that we need to come together and have that shared North Star, ultimately have the guidance and the direction from the state, and then establish the costs that we can agree on and determine what those costs are realistically and then fund them consistently. Because we find ourselves in this space, in this back and forth, and it is not something that is leading us to progress. A few other comments on just additional context. We have, as noted in the report, tried to manage our staffing levels appropriately. And as noted, we have had about a 20% reduction in our part-time faculty and staff, and we've had about a 10% reduction in our full-time faculty and staff as our enrollment has been decreasing. And we've done that without declaring financial crisis, and we've done that without having to require retrenchment. And I think that's a really important thing to know. I do not believe we need a new entity to manage higher education in our state. As already stated, we have the Office of Higher Education, and the University of Connecticut, the CSUs, and our community colleges are all defined in statute as to what we are meant to do, who we are meant to serve, who can offer PhDs, who can offer what kinds of degrees. It's already there. So I would say, let's get more structured guidance and secure the resources, and then we can execute consistently. My last few comments, let's get centered around our students. We talk a lot about funding and statistics, but this is about people, students, faculty, and staff. The students today are different from students when we were in college. They've grown up with school shootings that have been normalized. They've grown up with levels of pressure and anxiety because of social media in a way we do not understand. And they have suffered under COVID in ways that we still don't fully understand. Our faculty and staff have also been massively impacted by all of this. And they need to continue to evolve with emerging technology and the needs of industry and society, of course. But the faculty and staff are stressed, they are tired. This ongoing tension and conversation that is essentially a lingering, almost decades-long existential threat and crisis is wearing our people down. And they are the ones who do the noble work of serving our students day in and day out. So I'm incredibly grateful for our faculty and staff, and I'm really proud of them. So even as CSU evolves and works diligently to improve effectiveness, which we do every single day, true excellence for our students and system, I believe, is going to need more consistent resources, not fewer. I appreciate the time, Secretary Beckham. Thank you to you.
Thank you, Chancellor. So we've had a little planning for our next meeting, a little impromptu planning here in the last few minutes. There's tremendous interest in additional questions for our consultant. And we're going to explore bringing them back for the next meeting, which is scheduled for January 6th, so that folks who didn't get a chance to ask questions can do so then, and then we can all hear the answers. It's really important that everyone get the same information. So we're going to do it that way, I think, and we will explore that and see if we can get our consultant here on the January 6th meeting. So Mr. Prescott, and I think Mr. Jones was online as well. We didn't hear from him, but thank you both very much for all your work. We're going to be in touch to see what we can do going forward to bring you back. And we will, with that, we'll announce that the next meeting is January 6th at 1 p.m. in this room and via Zoom. And I look forward to seeing everyone at that. Our next item is to adjourn. It's motion made and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. We'll see you next month. Happy holidays.
Have a wonderful holiday all. Be safe.